Good evening. My name is Antigone Ladd, and I am delighted to be your host this evening for the program. I am a member of the board here at the Adams County Historical Society, and I am delighted. Wait, we're playing with the screen here. Okay. Go back one, Clinton. I'm not ready yet. Let me start all over. Good evening. My name is Antigone Ladd, despite the fact that under my photograph, it says Andrew Dalton. I'm using Andrew's computer tonight, and so we can take his name in vain. But I am hosting this program as I have assisted in several programs this year, and we have found it is just an amazing experience to meet new speakers, to learn new topics, and to have a really good time exploring history of Adams County. I would be remiss if I didn't thank the Dobbin House for continuing its regular support for all of our programs. And for those of you who have not contributed to the Adams County Historical Society but are enjoying our programs, I urge you to think about helping us pay for the programs and to help us build our new museum, our new education center, and our new research library. It's very simple. There's a donate button at the bottom of your screen. It's safe and it's very secure. Tonight, I'm going to be joined by Tim Smith. You want to wave at him, Tim? Who is historian and curator at the Historical Society. And Tim is going to be fielding questions from the audience. So please feel free to write out your questions. Professor Levine has agreed he would welcome your questions. So anything you want to know about Thaddeus Stevens, this is your opportunity. So let's turn to our speaker. And well, now we have the slides looking very small. I hope you can read this. Let me walk you through them. Our speaker this evening is Bruce Levine, an emeritus professor of history at the University of Illinois. Thank you, Clinton, much better. He also has taught at the University of California at Santa Cruz, at Columbia University in New York, at the New School for Social Research in New York, and the University of Cincinnati, and the City University of New York. As you can see from this list of books I have put up, he is the author of numerous books on the Civil War, on Reconstruction, and the working people who built America. I'm going to read off these titles to you in case you can't see them, because I can't imagine that for the audience we attract, there isn't at least one book here that you would be fascinated to read. The most recent one is The Fall of the House of Dixie, the Civil War and the Social Revolution that transformed the South. Then we have Confederate Emancipation, Southern Plans to Free and Arm Slaves During the Civil War. Then from his earlier studies on the people who built the country, the title is Who Built America? Working People and the Nation's Economy, Politics, Culture, and Society. Before that, The Spirit of 1848, German Immigrants, Labor Conflict, and the Coming of the Civil War. And my all-time favorite is Half Slave and Half Free, The Roots of the Civil War. I have it right here. I have it bookmarked all over the place. I challenge you, if you love Civil War history, to read this book and see if you can't find at least half a dozen facts that you didn't already know. And they are supported by the most incredible quotes. The research that he did in that book is amazing. So, with all of that bragging, let me turn it over to Bruce Levine, who began as a labor historian and then moved to the Civil War through studying the immigrant workers in the Civil War. I'd like to ask our guest, after thanking him, of course, for being here, start with a question. Bruce, what led you to decide to write a biography of Thaddeus Stevens? How did you even become interested in him?
Well, let me start, Antigone, by thanking you for inviting me onto this program, as well as Tim. and the Adams County Historical Society as a whole. I much appreciate the chance to talk with you. And so in answer to your question, I grew up in the era of the 1960s civil rights movement and was deeply moved by and supportive of that movement. And when I went to school, I mean, of course, public school, I learned that the root of what I was seeing and participating in, the struggle for equal rights for African Americans, stretched back hundreds of years. And when I began studying that past at the University of Michigan, I was lucky enough to have a professor who assigned to me a couple of books that introduced me to Thaddeus Stevens, among other people. One was W.E.B. Du Bois and his book, Black Reconstruction in America, which is actually a book about both the Civil War and Reconstruction, in which Thaddeus Stevens plays a prominent role, and a book by James McPherson called The Negroes' Civil War that also highlights Thaddeus Stevens, as well as Frederick Douglass, of course, and a whole host of other people. And I was deeply impressed with what Stevens had done and admired greatly what he had accomplished and fought for. And over time, I became convinced that his record represented the positive model of how to engage in political action. Say the truth. Fight for what you consider to be necessary. Compromise if you have no choice, but make clear when you do, when you have to settle for less, that you know you're settling for less and you intend to keep fighting for more. And candidly, although I identified myself as a liberal, I considered Thaddeus Stevens' conduct a positive alternative to the kind of what seemed to me weak, inconsistent championing of just causes that I found to be unfortunately common among modern liberal politicians. And I saw in Thaddeus Stevens someone with a firmer spine and more determination, and still someone who accomplished great things despite all the odds. And so he's been a hero and was a hero for me during much of my life, I will frankly acknowledge. And so when the opportunity arose to write about him, I jumped at it.
So my question to you now is, why is this time right? And who is your audience that you're speaking to? Is this a good time for us to re-examine Thaddeus Stevens?
Well, I certainly think so. And quite apart from an author's insistence that what he or she has written is extremely timely and needs as many readers as possible, it seems obvious to me that many of the issues that define Thaddeus Stevens' life and with which he grappled remain with us in altered form, to be sure, but are still live questions today. Thaddeus Stevens was a stalwart advocate, for example, long before the Civil War, of tax-supported public education. We're living in a time when the public schools are been starved of funds, and many of them are consequently providing much less adequate education than their students require. That remains, therefore, a live issue. Thaddeus Stevens considered this absolutely essential foundation for a just and democratic society, and I could only agree, and therefore consider the crippling of public education to be a criminal conduct. But probably more obviously, we've very recently been living through the era of Black Lives Matter and the protest against the murder of African Americans by police all across the country, and have been reminded of, by that and other issues, of the fact that this remains a deeply unequal society. And we're living at a time when strenuous efforts are being made to disfranchise African Americans and other poor people all over the country. And so it seems to me, studying the role of someone who was, in my opinion, on the right side of these questions may help to instill confidence in people today that that right side can still win.
Wonderful. Well, let's walk through his biography, which is a very unusual biography. It is not your standard one. I call it the psychological political biography, because you really, really did the research to get inside his thinking and learn all the influences on his life that led him to become such a radical politician. Could you start, for our readers or our viewers, go back to his childhood growing up in Vermont and walk us through how that affected his thinking, and then in particular, the research that you did on his college years, which that knocked me out when I read that section.
Okay, well, thank you for that kind appraisal of the work I did. I did indeed work quite hard to try to figure out what those early influences were. I was pretty sure that they would not solve the problem, that what happens to you in your first 20 years doesn't guarantee what will happen to you in your next 40, or in his case, 50 or 60. But it's important. It at least provides the core of who you are. And so, as you say, he was born and raised and remained in Vermont for his first 20 years or so. And I determined, therefore, it was necessary to read more than I had about Vermont in the era just before his birth. And what I learned was that this was a place that eventually becomes a state in which there were major struggles taking place, struggles by small farmers to hold on to their land against attempts by others, particularly in New York State, to preempt them and take their farms away from them, and struggles to institute a form of government at the state level that was probably more democratic than any other state in the Union, set out to create a legislature that was frequently elected, to make suffrage requirements quite extensive, or better to say, to make the electorate quite extensive, to include as many males as possible in the electorate, to create not a strong governor who was seen by Democrats, lowercase d Democrats, as being sort of the equivalent of a king, but a strong legislature that was considered more reflective of the people than would the governor be. And the state that inspired and infused with this democratic spirit ratified a constitution, the first constitution in North America, to condemn the enslavement of human beings. And Thaddeus Stevens grew up in the immediate aftermath of all this, at a time when all these events had made a deep impression on the state's political legacy and political atmosphere. He was also born into a poor farm family, and so identified with the problems of the poor. And he was born into a family pledged to the Baptist faith, a faith that traced its lineage back to the 17th century revolution in England that had overthrown the monarchy, that prized individual conscience, that prized community, solidarity, and mutual support. And these values as well, it seems clear to me, left their mark on Stevens. His mother was extremely religious and introduced him to that religion at a very early age. And so from all these directions, both from the state in which he lived, the family in which he was born, he was in a certain sense bathed in the waters of democratic thought. His family, he said later, especially impressed upon him the central idea of the Declaration of Independence, which was the most democratic document produced in the era of the American Revolution. And when he went off to public school, he then read about ancient republics in Greece and Rome by reading the ancient classics. And when he then went off to college, he read books infused with the spirit and the ideas of the Enlightenment of the 18th century that stressed reason. And insofar as they still champion religion, sought to reconcile religion and reason rather than make individuals accept things simply on faith. And in fact said that reason endorsed and proved the validity of religion, but strove therefore to emphasize the legitimacy of reasoning about such things. And in order to understand what Stevens was learning, I laid my hands, I'm sorry?
I'm going to pull up the picture of Dartmouth College here.
Okay. I laid my hands on as many as I could of the books that Stevens was assigned in college and read them and tried to summarize in the book what it was in them that likely influenced Stevens most permanently.
So you read all of his college books?
Well, probably not all, but as many as I could identify and then lay my hands on.
Amazing. So you are going inside his head.
I certainly tried to do so. It's hard to go inside his head for a variety of reasons that I think you're familiar with. He kept no diary. And his own letters, I found virtually illegible in most cases. He had one of the worst handwritings I've ever seen. And I've read a lot of handwriting from the 19th century, but nothing as bad as Thaddeus Stevens.
That's funny. Okay, see if I'm trying to fix the share screen and I'm not sure. Oh, there you go. You are back again. Okay. He gave the graduation address at Dartmouth, in which you talk about his amazing worldview for a young man. Would you share that with us?
Well, off the top of my head, I'll do the best I can. It was an address that, among other things, strongly endorsed, if I recall correctly, the value of economic development. And that was something else that I think pretty clearly he had attached himself to in reaction to his own poverty. It was by dint of the country's economic development and expansion that he eventually was able to raise himself out of poverty into considerable wealth. He also believed strongly in, therefore, the power of economic development, not only to achieve things materially. He credited economic development and what was then called the free labor society, what we would call capitalism, with having purged the culture of much of ignorance and superstition and replaced it with scientific reasoning. And so he championed that considerably. And if you remind me what other aspects of his lecture you'd like me to go into, I would appreciate that.
No, that's fine. The thought of him as a young man in college addressing the capitalist system in a graduation address seems just enormous. You know, where was he thinking? Where was he going? How did he decide to go into a legal career?
Well, Thaddeus Stevens was born lame, right? He was born with one lame foot, and that ruled out all sorts of occupations that involved heavy labor, strenuous labor.
Okay.
And his mother very early, therefore, decided that he needed to go into one of the professions. And I guess, because I don't know for sure, that he was attracted to the law because that was a profession that was expanding fairly radically in this era as commerce developed, and therefore the laws of commerce needed to involve larger and larger numbers of people, or better to say, larger and larger numbers of people found it necessary to involve themselves in the laws of commerce, and attorneys were the necessary intermediary between average citizens and the courts. It may also be the case that he considered the law to be the place where you fight for justice, or in the court system itself. He was somebody who was also always attracted to speech and was a very clever speaker. And of course, the law is someplace where that skill can get you particularly far.
Interesting. Tim, if I could turn to you for a minute, could you talk a little bit about Thaddeus Stevens in Gettysburg? Because we here in Gettysburg know him from his businesses, from his law practice, from the college. Did he have a strong impact on Gettysburg?
Well, Dr. Charles Gladfelter, of course, he was the director of the Adams County Historical Society, and, taught at Gettysburg College, was really into Thaddeus Stevens and taught me most everything I know about Thaddeus Stevens. But he has an interesting comment that he made about him. And, since he's no longer with us, I sometimes turn to his writings so that we can hear his words from, his own writings. It's interesting that Thaddeus Stevens, I guess he spent like 76 years. I think he was like 76 when he died. And about a third of his life, he spent in the New England area. And a third of his life, of course, he moved to Lancaster and spent there. But so about a third of his life, he spent in Adams County. And according to Dr. Gladfelter, Thaddeus Stevens arrived in the seat of Adams County in the fall of 1816 and began to practice law. Although a complete stranger to Gettysburg, he quickly gained considerable acceptance to the community. But by the time he left for Lancaster in the summer of 1842, of course, in search of larger opportunities, there were few aspects of Adams County life which he had not influenced in some major way. Between 1822 and 1831, Stevens served 6 one-year terms on the Gettysburg Borough Council. Between 1824 and 1833, he was a director of the Bank of Gettysburg, the only such institution in Adams County at that time. As early as 1826, he started to buy property around town and went into some businesses and ended up acquiring hundreds and hundreds of acres, if you count his land on the mountain, with his furnaces and all. He was, in 1837, he was the president of a local railroad company that eventually merged with the Pennsylvania Railroad Project and, what we call the Tapeworm Railroad Project. And of course, while he was here, he was a tireless champion of causes. And, he supported temperance. He opposed slavery. He befriended our local Black community. And when the anti-Masonic party came to power, he was one of the leading members and actually started a newspaper here, the Anti-Masonic Star. So he did a lot in the local community, and he made as many friends as also he made enemies, probably because of the way that he, went about his business and championed all these causes.
Thank you. Bruce, anything you want to add to that about his Gettysburg years?
I think Tim summed it up very well. He made a obviously big mark on Adams County and Gettysburg and launched his career there. But eventually, Gettysburg proved too small for his economic and political ambitions, and therefore moved to the larger site of Lancaster, as Tim just indicated. And it's in Lancaster that some other aspects of his life, of course, then develop.
You want to walk us through those? I was particularly interested in his fighting for Pennsylvania to get their constitution. I'm not sure what he did with that. I'm sorry.
He becomes a delegate from Lancaster to a convention called to amend the state constitution.
Amend it, thank you.
And in the course of doing that, two issues come up. One, he had already addressed in the state legislature, and that was the subject of tax-supported public education, where he basically turned around the lower house on that subject. In that era, the kind of public education that existed was one earmarked only for what were called paupers. There did not exist in the state a statewide system of public schools, free tuition public schools for all. And Thaddeus Stevens was one of the principal fighters for the establishment of such a system. But shortly after the legislature passes such a bill, howl of indignation goes up in many parts of the state, including his own, from people who didn't believe they should pay taxes to support the education of other people's children. And Thaddeus Stevens has to explain that the job of government is to provide you not only with things that you individually need, but things that will make a good society for you to live in. And if you value the wealth that you don't want to give up in taxes, you should want an educated citizenry around you who will know the law and who will respect individual rights. And you're not going to get that with population denied the requirements of education. And so, in fact, he is largely responsible for getting the House and then the Senate to reject the attempt to overturn the new legislation, for which he fails to be reelected to the House of the State House that next year, because of apparently a good deal of resentment from some of his own constituents who are clinging to their narrow conception of what government should be doing. But he is sent as a delegate to the state convention that I referred to. And there he has once again to fight on the education front and wins. But another battle he loses. An attempt is made to specify in the state constitution that the only people given the right to vote will be adult, specifically white men. And Stevens denounces this idea, says that it is in conflict with the basic spirit of the country and certainly the spirit of the Declaration of Independence. And he cannot change his colleagues' mind. And the Constitution that emerges from this convention in 36-37 does indeed, for the first time in Pennsylvania history, explicitly, clearly, statewide exclude Black men from the franchise. And Stevens is one of the very few delegates who refuses to sign the Constitution produced by that convention. And I think this is very important. This is an important signpost in his life, because the number of people pledged to the abolition of slavery in the 1830s in the North is very small. The number of people pledged to the right to vote by free African Americans is tiny. And Thaddeus Stevens is already there in 1836, 1837.
Now, you mentioned in the book that you thought maybe he had a strong trajectory toward the position in the national government. And you found, though, that it was more a zigzag direction, that he changes parties, he changes views on some things, that his core, it may be solid, but things around him are changing.
Yeah, I sort of naively assumed when I began the project that given all these democratic and even radically democratic influences on him as a child, that there would be more or less a straight line from there to the person we know, the adult we know in the era of the Civil War. So it was a surprise to me to discover that midway in his life, he expressed some views that he would never express in later life. And that's because, among other things, Thaddeus Stevens was raised, or better to say, educated in the principles of republicanism, small r, that derive from the ancient world. And one of the firm principles espoused by those ancient Republicans whom he studied in high school and again in college was that in order to have a stable republic, you cannot trust the voters in the cities, and you cannot trust the poorest individuals because they don't have enough property to make them cautious and conservative enough in the use of the franchise. And so at the same Constitution where Thaddeus Stevens is fighting for equal voting rights for Blacks, he's also fighting against the idea that people should have the right to vote regardless of how poor they are. He wants there to be a property, or at least a tax-paying requirement for voters. And he also wants the cities to be underrepresented in the state legislature because, like many ancient Republicans, he considers the cities to be dens of iniquity. These are the places occupied by the corrupt, very rich, and the corrupt, very poor, and especially the corrupt, very poor, who he believes, echoing what he had learned, could be manipulated by the very rich. And so he argues, as I said, for underrepresenting the cities in the state legislature. Now, so these are very anti-democratic notions, and Stevens is going to have to work that out. He's going to have to overcome that. And he largely does so in the course of his life. But something else that he probably picks up very early is a suspicion of immigrants. And that was very strong among New England, and in New England, especially New England Protestants, who are very suspicious of Catholics. They look upon Catholicism as the religion of the Middle Ages, as a religion that they consider to be anti-Republican, against republic with small r. And Thaddeus Stevens seems to imbibe some of that. Incidentally, the Constitution of Vermont that I mentioned earlier, that had been passed prior to his birth, that was so, in general, democratic, limited the right to hold office to Protestants. Catholics could not hold office. And they did not see any contradiction between that and the rest of their democratic outlook, because they considered Catholicism anti-democratic.
Interesting.
And so Thaddeus Stevens, in the course of his life, finds himself in bed with nativists. And it's not until the eve of the Civil War when he starts to pull himself out of that, and stand with the Republican Party when it finally in 1860 explicitly repudiates nativism and insists on the rights of immigrants to full citizenship rights.
Wow, what a change.
Yeah.
Now, what was he like to work with? Is he persuasive because of his logic, or does he take people aside and work them one-on-one, or does he write? Does he deliver speeches? How does he bring people around to his way of thinking?
I'm glad you asked that, because I think it points to an important aspect of Stevens' achievements that are that is often understated in studies of Stevens, which is to say, the work he does is not only in the legislature or in the state constitution or in the Congress. He's anxious to speak over the heads as well, over the heads of his colleagues to the general public. And that, I think, it is in his speeches, which in many cases are then reprinted, not only in local newspapers, but as pamphlets that circulate in some cases by the thousands throughout the country, that he sets out to, and to a degree succeeds in, reshaping public opinion on a series of questions, just as he had signally managed to do at an early date on the subject of public education in Pennsylvania. So I think his primary role is not buttonholing people in the way someone like Lyndon Johnson would later make famous, but in speaking on the floor of the Congress or outside Congress to large audiences, communicating directly to them in carefully prepared, very clear and forceful speeches, just as he had done successfully in court, and in the course of the circulation of his words in print.
Interesting. Now, somewhere I read that to find the kinds of things he talked about in Congress, you read the congressional record?
That's right.
I'm
In
sorry.
those days called the Congressional Globe.
Oh, my word. Because as you said, he's not keeping a diary.
Right.
And his handwriting is miserable. Do we have letters or documents from Stevens? What papers have been saved from his lifetime?
Well, two authors, two scholars by the name of Palmer and Ochoa have managed to scour one collection of documents after another that contained letters from or letters to Thaddeus Stevens, and then put them all on microfilm. So it wasn't necessary to visit each one of these separate collections,
okay.
Rather simply get hold of, which I managed to do, of the microfilm, and there is material of the kind I just described, including reproductions of newspaper articles. There's also material at the Library of Congress collected by one of his colleagues, Edward McPherson, who thought he would write a biography of Stevens and therefore did himself collect a great deal of stuff about Stevens, and I consulted that as well. But then there are, of course, other things, because although Stevens himself didn't have a diary, people who knew him kept diaries and would make a record in the diary of conversations they had had with Stevens, or things that they saw happen to Stevens, or they would write memoirs that included such information. And then, of course, there are newspaper articles written by reporters who would be in the room with Stevens, including at party caucuses, when Stevens is a member of the Republican Party caucus in the United States Congress, and there are reporters for the New York Times, the New York Tribune, who are taking down his words, or at least summarizing what he says, to try to influence his fellow Republicans. So there's plenty of material like that available, and sifting through it was necessary and onerous.
Do I dare ask how long it took to put this book together?
It took about 6 years to put the book together. But that in turn also drew upon about 30 plus years of my own study and teaching on the general subject of the Civil War era. So by the time I came to do this book, I thought I had at least a good sense of the era, but I had no idea how much I had yet to learn about Stevens' place in that era.
Well, let me ask you, have other biographers done right by Stevens, or have they misguided their readers? What did you find that was new or a different angle?
Well, one different angle is the one I just mentioned, which is the fact that Stevens had to work his way through a series of anti-democratic notions that he had championed at an early stage of his life. By the way, anti-democratic notions that he shared with many people in the Whig Party, of which he eventually became an important figure. But I also tried to pay close attention to the way in which Stevens did not act simply as a lone individual. I don't believe in the hero theory of history, that, you know, the great savior arrives on the scene and by virtue of his or her own genius transforms history. It depends a great deal on circumstance and the efforts of other people as well. You're not a leader if you have no followers. And in order to have followers, there need to be people who share ideas with you. And so, for example, when Stevens is fighting for the right of African Americans in Pennsylvania to vote, he is not the first to launch that fight. The African American population, the free African American population of Pennsylvania, is already in that fight by the time Stevens addresses the convention in Pennsylvania. And the same is true even on a larger scale when Stevens is fighting for emancipation of slaves during the Civil War, and later for granting full citizen rights to emancipated slaves. African Americans have been doing that for years before Stevens' birth, and at the time, especially when the issue of slavery is heating up in the country. And for example, in the 1850s, when Stevens makes a mark as an attorney in Pennsylvania, defending a group of slaves who have escaped from their owner in neighboring Maryland and found refuge in Pennsylvania, and who, when their owner shows up with a posse to try to take them back into slavery, they resist arms in hand and they kill the man who claims to be their owner. Well, yes, Thaddeus Stevens plays an important role as the attorney, but without the fugitives themselves, there'd be no story. And the same is true over and over and over again in the course of the struggle against slavery and for equal rights. What he does is important and possible only because other abolitionists, African Americans more broadly, eventually the Republican Party, the citizens who vote for Republican candidates, the citizens who enroll in the Union armies and go off to war. I've tried to fill the book with that kind of sense that this isn't a lone hero. This is someone who simply is giving voice to the spirit of the times.
Let's talk about him now in Washington, where he is going to influence the new Republican Party. And, you know, I don't think we need to compare him to Lincoln, because we know that they are believing in the same things, but how we get there is clearly very different. How do he and Lincoln interact? Does he help guide, push, irritate Lincoln? How was their relationship?
I think the answer, Antigone, is all of the above. I think he irritates Lincoln. He certainly irritates Lincoln's secretaries, who are very defensive of Lincoln, very protective of Lincoln, and therefore very angry at any members of the Republican Party who criticized Lincoln for being too slow to move in the direction of emancipation, which Stevens did do. Stevens and Lincoln both hated slavery, and both of them hated it from an early age. But I think it's pretty clear Stevens hated it more passionately, and he made opposition to it more central to his life much earlier than Lincoln did. Lincoln doesn't do very much about it until the 1850s, and the middle of the 1850s at that. And as I've tried to point out, Stevens is already at it in the mid 1830s at the latest. So Stevens is more fervent and he's more politically radical than Lincoln, because to be for emancipation, much less equal rights, is the mark of radicalism in this era. He, in the 1840s, is, if not earlier, active in the Underground Railroad in Pennsylvania. And archaeological work in Lancaster, in property he owns, suggests that he harbored fugitive slaves on that property and hid them on that property at an early stage. Abraham Lincoln did not do that. In 1850, when a tremendous controversy blows up that pits North versus South over what to do with the lands taken from Mexico during the Mexican War, a compromise is finally struck. That compromise includes a provision that potentially allows slavery to spread into much of the land taken from slavery under the doctrine of popular sovereignty, which provides that the question will be answered by the white residents of those territories. That compromise also includes a fugitive slave law that makes it easier for people like the one from Maryland who gets killed in Pennsylvania to reclaim and recapture fugitives. So that compromise package includes a lot of support for slavery. Abraham Lincoln endorses that compromise for the sake of keeping the country together. Thaddeus Stevens refuses to do so. And even after the compromise is ratified and his fellow Whigs decide, okay, it's enough talking about this, it's settled, it's done, let's not relitigate this anymore because we don't want to divide our own party, much less divide the country. Thaddeus Stevens will have none of that and keeps criticizing the aspects of this compromise that he considers illegitimate. And so he has already, long before the Civil War, staked out a position on these subjects well ahead of Lincoln, and will do so throughout the Civil War and the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. He calls for the abolition of slavery throughout the United States a full year before Abraham Lincoln endorses the idea in 1864. And I think that's pretty much the way it goes. In answer, I'm sorry, I know this is a long-winded answer.
No, I'm loving it.
But I do want to say that Lincoln would have been the last person to say that Thaddeus Stevens showed me the way. But I think it's clear that Thaddeus Stevens helped to pave the way that made it possible for Lincoln to do what he eventually does, precisely by his work in Congress and in helping to re-educate the Republican Party rank and file throughout the course of the war. And a number of people close to Lincoln basically say as much. And indeed, Carl Schurz and a number of other individuals who were close to Lincoln claim that Lincoln valued the role that Stevens had staked out as being in advance of him, precisely because it did then make it possible for him to do things like the Emancipation Proclamation.
Antigone,
Yes.
we have a couple questions.
All right, thank you.
One of them, well, I can answer two of them, and one of them is definitely for our speaker. But one of them was somebody had just asked if he's part of the Adams County Bar. And yes, I don't remember exactly what year he became a member of the bar, but yes, he was. And someone asked about Edward McPherson. Because they said, oh, is this the Edward, you mentioned Edward McPherson papers at the Library of Congress. And yes, Edward McPherson was from Adams County. He served 2 terms in Congress, and then he lost his seat, but then became the clerk of the House of Representatives. And he was, he wrote several handbooks on Congress, and he was kind of an encyclopedia on legislative matters. And I think if you watch the movie Lincoln, which maybe we'll discuss just shortly at the end here, he's actually shown in there as taking the roll call there in the movie. And also someone asked this question because they read a book that I wrote on Lee's headquarters. The widow, Mary Thompson, was having some trouble. Her husband had disappeared or abandoned her, and she had 8 children, and she rented a house, and I guess it was going to be sold at sheriff's auction, and he stepped in and purchased the house, and then she kind of put up some of the money, but also rented from Thaddeus Stevens. And this person, who is named Thompson, so maybe they're related to the Thompsons, he asked if you detected that did Thaddeus Stevens play a role in early women's rights?
Thaddeus Stevens takes part in a debate in Lancaster on the subject of women's suffrage. And I think it's 1848, but I wouldn't swear by it. I'd need to look in my own book for the reference, in which Thaddeus Stevens is one of the main speakers in support of women's suffrage and women's rights more generally. I don't know at what point in his life he takes up that position, but by that date, he seems to be a champion of it.
Very good. A couple things, of course, you're probably familiar with the fact that your comments on taxes for schools in the area were controversial initially. I always like to point out to people that some of these issues that we have today are not like current issues. We hear all the time that maybe people who don't have children in school and are retired, why should they pay taxes on their property to go to the schools? But this isn't a new thing. And I wanted to mention that here in our community over the years, we see evidence of Stevens' struggles with his moral stance and commercial development and free labor. It seems there's some examples like with the Pennsylvania Railroad or some of the foundries he was involved in, some of the business operations. If you were his friend or business partner, he might look the other way if you weren't, running your business exactly the way you should. And the third thing I wanted to mention is that in Adams County, the American Party, which the Know Nothing Party, the anti-nativist party you were referring to, took stronghold in our county in 1855. And it wasn't until after the presidential election that the Know Nothing Party really disappeared from here. During the presidential election, there was still a strong sentiment towards anti-nativism. And, Thaddeus Stevens probably saw that the anti-nativists were pushing the German vote into the Democratic Party, and by getting rid of some of that anti-nativist rhetoric and encouraging the Germans that were coming into the country to vote Republican, that really helped the party.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. And I don't think we need actually even to speculate about that, because Stevens notes specifically in 1860 what I wrote about in my first book, which was that substantial number of German immigrants in that era were indeed coming over to the Republican Party and were anti-slavery. And I think that has to have had an influence on Stevens in pulling him out of alliance with nativists, an alliance that he had stuck with well into the 1850s, he and a number of his associates. So but the fact that he sees that, contrary to the claim that was widely made by critics of the immigrants, that they were easily manipulated and that they could not be counted on to support progressive causes, was clearly not true of the Germans, especially in this era, especially in the 1848 plus era of immigrants. And the Republican Party as a whole, for that reason in part, and because a number of these Germans are starting to become leaders of the state units of the Republican Party, finally does something in 1860 that it hadn't really done in 1856, which is, as I think I mentioned earlier, explicitly repudiate nativism. And Thaddeus Stevens, who had earlier resisted doing something like that, seems not to have made a peep this time. And I think we can, in this case, speculate that he was indeed being influenced precisely by the factor that Tim points out.
Interesting. Can we move him forward to the end of the war, where I find he is an amazing parliamentarian in trying to decide to bring the Southern congressmen back? Could you talk about his skill in, I can't believe he did that and got away with it.
Well, Stevens believes that if we, as soon as the war is over, if we bring these states right back into full status, full standing in the Union, we're going to see them sending basically Confederates to the Congress. And there they will link up with their former allies, the Northern Democrats, and together they will undo everything that we have accomplished during the Civil War, both undo emancipation, but certainly undo equal rights, and quite probably undo a series of economic development measures that were passed by the Republican Congress for the first time able to do so when the Southern states withdrew from Congress during the war. So Thaddeus Stevens believes that these states should be taken at their word. They said they were out of the Union. Let us acknowledge that they're out of the Union, and let us keep them out of the Union and govern them as federal territories until such time as we are convinced that they will act as genuine democratic Republican citizens. But he doesn't succeed in convincing the Republican Party to go that way. And so he's fighting afterward a rearguard action against the more moderate members of his own party who are striving to put the country back into normal life, both commercially and politically. And so some of his erstwhile allies are pushing very hard to bring these states back into the Union and bring the Southern congressmen back into their seats in the House and the Senate. And you can almost see Thaddeus Stevens digging in his heels, but losing this tug of war. And so in the course of losing, he throws up as many obstacles as he can to these states resuming their ability to eventually gain a majority in the Congress.
So tell us what he accomplished.
Well, so long as they're out, he helps to pass a series of measures that do indeed reinforce the rights of African Americans. But he can already see around the time of his death that many of the accomplishments of the wartime and immediate post-war era are under threat both from a renewed surge of white supremacy, white supremacism in the South, and the deepening political conservatism in his own Republican Party, and a general sense that is getting widespread in the North of enough of this. We've been at this since at least the 1850s. Now we've lost all these young men. We've paid all this money to fight this war. Let's bring this sectional conflict to an end and get back to peaceful, prosperous, united country. Well, Stevens doesn't want to do that if it comes at the expense of the rights of the former slaves. But ultimately, that battle is not won by Stevens and his co-thinkers. And that's the birth of Jim Crow.
So toward his later years, you write, and you have some quotes from him where he is feeling that he doesn't have any great contributions. He's feeling down about himself. What do you consider his greatest accomplishments? 1, 2, 3, 5, however many.
The 13th Amendment to the Constitution,
Okay.
the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, and the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, which he does not write, and which is passed after his death, but which he champions during his life. It is Stevens and the spirit of Stevens that can be seen as central to the passage of all of those amendments. And those amendments, after all, provide at least the legal basis for the civil rights movement 100 years later, because they at least have on the books in the Constitution rights that the movement can claim need to be honored and enforced. But perhaps even more than that, he leaves behind the record of someone who fought for such things and fought so courageously for such things and with such tremendous energy. And as I approach his age when he was doing those things, I marvel at the energy that he managed to mobilize at that stage of life. It seems to me not only admirable, but amazing.
Okay, Tim, any other questions? I have a couple of slides I want to pull up if I may.
Yeah, we did have one question. I came up twice, and
Okay,
I was actually thinking about it myself, and I have no idea the answer to this question, but maybe it was just circumstance. But why Gettysburg? Why did Thaddeus Stevens find himself here in our town?
The best I can determine is that a friend of his, in search of work, left Vermont, which was not a very prosperous place or a very populous place, and moved into Adams County and found a teaching job in Pennsylvania. And I think Stevens probably was following the path blazed by this friend.
okay. Tim, any other?
It's my best answer I have.
Well, we do have the, I didn't know if you wanted to say this, we do have the one question.
Which we're expecting, but we didn't get yet.
Okay, the Lydia Hamilton Smith is born in Adams County. She married a guy in Gettysburg, Jacob Smith. Her husband was a barber. His shop was probably on Chambersburg Street, very close to where Thaddeus Stevens lived for a number of years. At what currently it would be 51 York Street, although the house no longer stands. And then of course, she moved to Lancaster. And since people here are very familiar with Lydia Hamilton Smith, what was your reaction when you saw the movie Lincoln at the end, when they insinuated that they were much more than just friends and colleagues, that they were secret lovers?
Well, indeed. I don't think that's the most egregious historical leap made in that movie, but I think it is quite a leap, or at least better to say, I found no evidence of that relationship. I think that he was not only her employer, but that they were genuine friends, that they in turn shared friends. and that he deeply admired her and had great affection for her. Beyond that, I found nothing insisting that the movie version is true, except, of course, what Democratic opponents considered a potent accusation, right? That this guy is so low, he's taken a Black woman as his lover. And Stevens, although it may very well not have been true, never publicly denied it. And that must have been a decision Stephen made, not to honor the idea that there'd be something heinous about this if it were true. So he never denies it. He never confirms it. And he leaves her money. I think it's like $500 a year for the rest of her life in his will. But I think it's a great, as I said earlier, a great leap to assume that there's a romantic or sexual relationship between the two. I should add that if somebody comes up with a document tomorrow that proves that it was true, I won't be shocked and I won't be amazed. All I am saying is that I haven't seen such a document or such evidence now.
Okay, and then we had the other picture of Tommy Lee Jones as Stevens. What did you think of his portrayal in the movie?
Well, I love Tommy Lee Jones in general. And I thought it was a very entertaining portrait, but it was jarring to hear Thaddeus Stevens from Vermont speaking with a Texas accent.
Oh, that's true.
But more than that, the film presents, I think, Thaddeus Stevens as a person too radical for his time.
Oh.
Somebody too far ahead of the general public, too far in advance, and difficult to force to compromise, to become realistic. Lincoln is the voice of sophisticated sanity in the argument between him and Stevens. Stevens is the kind of wild-eyed radical who can't understand that you can only accomplish certain things at certain times. And you'd never know from that portrait, again, that it was Stevens who had championed an emancipation and abolition amendment before Lincoln ever came around to it. And the film also finally makes it look like Lincoln prevails upon Stevens to finally back down and to muffle his radicalism. And that's a complete misunderstanding of the speech that Stevens gives, because a Democratic opponent demands of him that he give up his belief in equality between Black and white. Stevens says, I'm not saying in all things, just in equal rights. And then the Democrat says, well, I call upon you to give up your demand for equal rights. And Stevens says, I won't do it. Well, equal rights is a big thing, and it is more than emancipation, because there are all sorts of countries throughout the Western Hemisphere who emancipate their slaves and then place them in a subordinate place in society. Thaddeus Stevens refused to do that and believed that they should become full-fledged members of society. And to portray it otherwise, I think, denigrates what he actually stood for and misrepresents an important moment in that history.
Wow, thank you so much. Tim, do you have any other questions that we need to cover?
No, I think that's a really nice program, and I myself look forward to reading your book.
The book is amazing. I think you will very much enjoy it. And Bruce,
the other book on the Germans, that's one of my favorite topics. I can't wait to take a look at that also.
Well,
but I think the audience would really love this from all the positive feedback.
Great. So may I ask technical questions about the show? So I gather it is or was being live streamed on Facebook?
On Facebook, and tomorrow it will be on YouTube. So you go to YouTube and type in Adams County Historical Society, and it will be up there.
And who could access it on Facebook? Anybody?
Anybody.
Huh.
You go onto Facebook and type in Adams County Historical Society. So it's the same method to get it on Facebook for today, and starting
Gotcha.
tomorrow, it'll be on YouTube.
Great.
The amazing thing I have to share with you is that in going to our live programming, we have expanded our audience amazingly. We started with an auditorium that would only hold under 100 people. And there were times when that was packed. And for one of our most recent programs, we had 100,000 viewers.
Wow.
So the fact that is able to stay up on YouTube means that people who missed it at 7 o'clock on Thursday night can call in and get it whenever they are able to watch it. And so I go and check the numbers every week, and sure enough, they jump immensely. So I'm hoping we can help your book sales.
I hope so too.
And I
Thank you.
really
Thank you. Thank you.
appreciate your time and your interest in bringing Thaddeus Stevens to a whole new audience.
Thank you again, both of you, Antigone and Tim. I much enjoyed the time with you and appreciate your having me on.
Thank you very much. Now I
Yeah.
have to figure out how to shut the program down. We have to press stop.
May I sign off?
Yes, sir. Thank you very, very much.
Quite welcome. Thank you.
More stop live stream. We're off.